All right, be sure to go and check out that wonderful conference coming up again this October. God willing, I plan to be down there myself, and look forward to some great sessions down at SES in Charlotte, North Carolina. So today we have with us a very special guest, as we're going to discuss the flawed views of Jesus mythicism. Christianity has been met with several objectors in recent times, and of the many groups that seem to criticize Christian beliefs and values, none is perhaps more radical than this Jesus mythicist movement. While this movement holds little to no authority in scholarship or academia today, many online seem to approve the idea that Jesus of Nazareth was simply a mythical figure invented by the early Christians. Many of these individuals who basically come from online communities will say that Jesus was an invention from some group, some ancient myths like Horus and others. And so obviously, as we mentioned before, there's little or no scholarly support for the Jesus mythicist movement. But it is very important for us as Christians to have a voice in this debate. And our guest today does so. And he engages many individuals online opposing the Jesus mythicist movement, especially one Ken Humphreys, as he's had some online debates with Ken Humphreys. Our guest today is Nick Peters. Nick Peters has studied at SES, Southern Evangelical Seminary, and also from Johnson Bible College. Nick Peters runs the Deeper Waters online ministry that can be found at deeperwaters.ddns.net. There you can catch his blog, and also he has a Deeper Waters podcast, which is also available on iTunes. Man, the list could go on and on and on. We could say several different things about Nick, wonderful things about Nick. He is the son-in-law to Michael Lacona. He is also, adding to his resume, has recently been a guest on William Lane Craig's Defenders class, as he filled in for William Lane Craig, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, last week. So we welcome with us today Mr. Nick Peters on the Bellator Christi podcast. Thank you, Nick, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on, my friend.
Oh, the pleasure is mine, Brian. Thank you for asking to have me come on. It's always an honor to get to speak on topics like this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you would, as we always ask our guests on the podcast, especially the first time on the podcast, would you mind sharing with our listeners how you came to accept Christ as your Savior?
Yeah, well, when I was growing up in church, I'd attend Sunday school every week, and I was either the only person in there, or as a young elementary schooler and such, I was the only boy in there. Now, later on, I probably would have said hallelujah to that, but at the time, it wasn't anything I cared for. And across the street, there was another church, and some of my friends from school attended that. My parents said they were fine with me going there. And the first Sunday there, I heard explicitly the gospel teaching and thought, well, that sounds like a good deal to me. And that took care of that. So that's how that came about.
Well, we were talking about, I gave just a brief description of the Jesus mythicist movement, and you've engaged many of the individuals from this Jesus mythicist movement. How would you describe this Jesus mythicist movement to our listeners, and who were some of the biggest advocates in this latest push for Jesus mythicism?
You know, you want to try and be as charitable as you can when talking about opposing views and such, but in this case, it is really, really hard. I mean, I meet Christians who think the Illuminati is behind everything and see all these conspiracy theories and such. And we have cases of 9/11 truthers out there and people like that. And I describe Jesus mythicism as a conspiracy theory for atheists. And that's largely what it is. And when we get to the last question, I think it is, that you sent me, we'll show how I think that can be exploited very well for arguments for historicism. Now, the big names in the movement, in scholarship, there are only two. really that are big, big names at this point. Richard Carrier is a main one who is considered to be the be-all and end-all of New Testament scholarship by internet atheists. Everyone else, they pretty much say, who? A lot of them have no idea who he is. He hasn't produced much peer-reviewed work or anything like that. He's just largely known on the internet. And then Robert Price is out there as well. Now, as far as I know, these people don't teach at accredited universities either. I mean, like you said, if you go to the academy, this isn't a debate. No one is wondering about this. Now, outside the academy, you'll find several smaller names, people like Dan Barker, for instance, or Slate Akalia Etz, who's also known as Dorothy Murdoch, and Ken Humphreys, who I did debate on the Mind Renewed podcast, hosted by Julian Charles. But aside from those kinds of names and such, you don't find many people advocating this, and for good reason.
Well, absolutely, and it made me think, as you were listening to names, as you mentioned, Bart Ehrman, I remember seeing a video where he was even speaking at an atheist conference and said, listen, if you think that Jesus was simply a myth, you're going to look really foolish. And so I think that says a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, some people are looking and say, well, the field is dominated by Christian scholars. Well, not really. I mean, you could even practically say it's probably like half and half down the line. And I read non-Christian New Testament scholars regularly. Jesus' mythicism, for the most part, is lucky to get a footnote. I think the only reasons that people like Maurice Casey and Bart Ehrman have written about it is they're just exasperated with the whole thing.
Wow. So, I mean, that already shows the power behind, the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth already, just by the fact that, as you say, they don't even get a footnote, hardly, this movement. Well, how did the Jesus mythicist movement begin?
Well, there have been throughout history some people who have tried to argue that Jesus never existed. Bruno Bauer was probably one of the first ones who really majorly put forward a hypothesis. Every time in history it's been put forward, it's been destroyed pretty quickly, and this even by the non-Christian scholars. What's really changed things, though, is the internet. The internet where anyone can go out there and say, hey, I'm an authority because I have an opinion and I'll put it on a website. Well, no, you're not. And that's part of the problem, that we don't know how to analyze information more. You put up a YouTube video, you put up a podcast, you put up a blog post, and people say, well, it must be true. Now, of course, when I say that, I realize I've got all three of those things. So what I would say to someone who said to me, well, does that mean that your stuff isn't true then? I said, well, maybe it isn't. If you want to find out if what I think is true, go check and evaluate everything I've said. Go through and read it and consult the leading scholars and see what you think in response. But today we have a mindset of people that will pretty much just believe anything, provided it already goes with what they already believe in. They just don't evaluate the claims at all. And largely one of the big things that got this movement started was a movie called Zeitgeist, which had in it also the idea that 9/11 was an inside job and some theory about the banks and such at the end. But it's a 2-hour movie, and the first third of it was devoted to Jesus never even existing. And it's the kind of movie that when you get done, you want to ask, who do I sue to get those last 2 hours of my life back?
I'll admittedly say I've never seen Zeitgeist, but I have heard that it was a key player in the at least in the popularity of this movement, per se, that it seems prevalent, at least on the online communities. When you engage Jesus mythicists, do you use the Bible to demonstrate the historical validity of Jesus of Nazareth? And if you do, how do you use these particular texts?
Well, personally, I prefer to start with extra biblical texts, but you do need to use the Bible. And the problem is, unfortunately, many Christians and many atheists and skeptics take the same approach to the Bible in many ways. That approach is it's an all or nothing game. Either everything is true in there or everything is false and should be viewed with immediate suspicion. Christians and atheists play it the exact same way too many times. The only difference is their loyalty. When we approach the Bible, I say, okay, let's be fair. Let's try to approach the Bible like any other historical text of the time. Don't treat it with a different standard. Treat it with the same standard. Now, some Christians in the audience I think, well, I don't know if it's a wise idea to do that, which I'd say, why? Are you scared Christianity won't pass the test? I can do it because I don't have any fear. I think if you do a historical investigation and treat it fairly, you'll find that the claims of the Bible do stand up. But this one, we got a base minimum claim. There was a historical figure called Jesus. Now, if you want to say, okay, Jesus was real, but he wasn't the Messiah, or he certainly didn't think he was God, or he wasn't God, or he didn't rise from the dead, or something like that. Okay, that's a different claim. Now, that's a claim that's acceptable in academia and such, and that's a claim we should be out there trying to refute. But it's not the nonsense claim that mythicism is. I mean, there are so many people out there who are convinced in the scholarly world that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, but they will not want to play the card of mythicism because it's just not a serious hypothesis.
And one thing I have to think about is, why would individuals create something and then die the most exquisite deaths, for this lie that they apparently, or according to Jesus' mythicists, made up? I mean, to me, that makes no sense.
Well, something I'd caution when you use that argument. Sean McDowell has come out with his book on the deaths of the apostles, and I hesitate when people say that all the apostles, except for maybe John, went and died for convictions, because frankly, we don't have that kind of evidence for all of them. But what I will say is that Christianity grew up in an honor-shame context, and one of the best books you can read on that is a book like Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes by Brandon O'Brien and Randolph Richards. And in this context, the Christian belief was utterly shameful. And shame was something you wanted to avoid entirely. People cared about honor and shame back then more than we care about paying our bills today. It was all about your reputation and such, but that's for another show sometime. But the thing is, if you are going out and you are saying, how am I going to make a religion that will attract people to it and such, Christianity is a textbook example of what you would not make.
Right. And that's an interesting perspective. I've never thought about that before. You mentioned that, about the honor and shame type of culture. I know at Liberty I studied some of the cultures in the East, Middle East, in the Far East and all, and many of those cultures share the honor-shame type of format that we as Westerners may not understand. And that's a great point, that to bring dishonor into one's family, or upon oneself was seen as a very serious thing in that culture, even today.
There's a book that's going to be coming out next month. I've already read an advanced copy of it and interviewed the author of it on my show, and that's Larry Hurtado's book, Destroyer of the Gods. And he's written about how Christianity was really unique from the other religions of the time. It's very eye-opening. I mean, I read honor-shame stuff a whole lot, and I still ever thought, boy, there was some good stuff in here I hadn't even considered before.
Oh, wow. So I definitely have to check that book out, absolutely. Well, and I think you may have already answered this question. Is the Jesus mythicist movement primarily an internet sensation, or does the movement hold any scholarly backing? I know you mentioned Carrier and Price. Would you just basically say that this is kind of an internet sensation?
Yeah, I mean, Carrier and Price are the only ones in the field. I mean, you could have people like, say, Jerry Coyne, who's an evolutionary biologist, or Evan Ferris, who's a philosopher, who say, yeah, I'm a I'm a mythicist, but they're not scholars in that field. So it's just as valid as asking what's my opinion on evolutionary theory, for instance. I could have one, but I'm not a scientist in the field, so what difference does it make what my opinion is?
Gotcha. Well, what are some tips that you could provide for our listeners? Suppose maybe there's someone listening out there, maybe they've encountered a Jesus mythicist online, or maybe they've encountered a Jesus mythicist maybe as a member of their family or one of their friends or coworkers or so on. What are some tips that you could provide our listeners to be able to engage the Jesus mythicist, and what are some tools that they would need in their apologetic?
The sad thing is that mythicist arguments can often be problematic for a lot of people, not because they're so good, but because they're so obscure and eccentric. They hang on 1,000 different presuppositions that no one in the field really takes seriously. It becomes a sort of shotgun approach. I mean, when Richard Carrier debated Craig Evans, he comes out with, well, Luke used Josephus, and Mark is based on the Homeric epics, and X, Y, Z, and all of these over and over. And that's just a shotgun approach. It really overloads a lot of people. I would tell them they need to study up as much as they can. If they're going to engage this, it needs to be something serious, and try and study, for instance, other ancient religions, such as Mithraism, or Horus and Osiris, or Dionysus and such. Because the pagan copycat thesis is another one that's often used. Again, that one isn't treated seriously in academia, but it's out there, and a lot of it rests on misconceptions. I mean, take Mithras, for instance. We are told that Mithras was born of a virgin. Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, rocks would be virgins by definition. And that Mithras died? No, he never died. We don't even have any scriptures of Mithras right now. And if you look at all these other religions and such, it doesn't work. I mean, if people think Horus and Osiris and such are parallels with Jesus' story, and this is my challenge to them, find one living professional Egyptologist today, I mean, someone with a degree in the field, and show him the story of Jesus and and ask him, does that sound like the story of Horus or Osiris? Ask him, is it maybe getting close or anything? Try and find them. Good luck with that. I mean, some of the resources you can find are, Bartram did write his book, Did Jesus Exist? It's pretty good. My friend Albert McElhenney has written several ebooks in great detail refuting mythicism. That's some of the best material you can get. J.P. Holding of Tectonics.org, he's written books like Shattering the Christ Myth. Again, some of the best stuff that you can get. And you're really not going to find a lot of scholars engaging with this as much because, frankly, they don't think it's worth their time. That's how little attention is paid to this movement. So you have to really rely on a lot of us in the field who are relying on scholars. So Stephen Bedard is another good one. My friend Stephen Bedard at Hope's Reason, and by the way, we both have something in common, that we're on the autism spectrum, which I pretty need as well.
Well, absolutely. And this is kind of going a little off the record here, a little off the questions we had planned. How do you seek to engage? Because you do a lot of engagement of individuals online. What are some tips you can provide? What are some do's and don'ts to engaging people in, like, perhaps even on social media and whatnot?
Okay, I keep a file with me. It's an apologetics database where I have a lot of quotes and such that I can use, and I can pull up at any time. Those are very helpful to have nearby. And I also think it's great that I've got the advantage. I've got a podcast, so anything wants that, I can say, yeah, I interviewed someone on this one. But I also say, choose your battles wisely. Frankly, a lot of times it's not worth it. I mean, if you choose to battle every single person you meet on the internet who's wronged, you're going to waste a lot of your time. And I have any more better usages of my time. I can be studying such. I can be spending time with my lovely wife, things of that sort. There are other things to be done. Choose your battles wisely and make sure you know exactly what you're arguing for and what you're arguing against. When I'm out there, I'm arguing usually for the resurrection. I'm not arguing for inerrancy. I'm not arguing for infallibility. I'm going for the bare text, just saying, I just want to show you that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, if you come to believe in inerrancy and other things later, great. But I would rather have you have the wrong position on the Bible and the right position on Jesus than some other way.
Right. Well, and that's a good point, because I've noticed that so many times if you engage someone, and especially if there's a group of people, there's like 2 or 3 individuals trying to ask questions, it's easy to get distracted on other topics instead of the primary topic at hand. So very, very good advice.
Yes. Inerrancy is a big one. I mean, one thing I tell people is that don't get caught up in that debate with non-believers, because usually what they'll do is they'll provide you a list of 101 Bible contradictions. You could go out there and answer every single one of those, and all they'll do is produce another list of 101 Bible contradictions for you. Go to the main issue, resurrection.
Good point. Good point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, otherwise your conversation gets so distracted. You know, I mean, that makes sense. Your conversation gets so distracted that it's easy to lose the main focus, the main point. And like you said, especially with unbelievers, excellent advice. Excellent advice. You operate an online ministry, and I need to make a correction. I posted on here, it was deeperwaters.wordpress.com. Actually, it's deeperwaters.ddns.net. So for our listeners, if you see that on the listing of the podcast, just make that correction: deeperwaters.ddns.net. Tell us a little bit about your online ministry and how people can donate.
Yeah, my ministry I started back in 2007 after reading Hugh Hewitt's book Blog, where he said every Christian out there should have a blog. And my wife even has a blog as well. And her blog, by the way, is written in red. She meant to put I-N red, but she actually typed I-M red, and that's at blogspot.com. She's got some good stuff there. She's not a just like I am, but she's got some good motivational stuff and such. But anyway, my ministry started there in 2007 with me regularly blogging. Now I blog pretty much 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, and then I do a podcast every Saturday. I've been doing a podcast for about 3 years now, and I have got a several number of guests who have come on the show now. People would say, yeah, Mike Lacona, okay, he's your father-in-law, he's going to come on. Okay, Gary Habermas has been on, Craig Keener has been on, Craig Evans has been on, Richard Bauckham has been on, Larry Hurtado has been on, Daniel Ross has been on, Craig Blumberg. I could go on. If you look at my list and you find no one you're interested in the apologetics world, you're not paying much attention to the apologetics world. But my ministry has a number of focuses. Like I've said, the resurrection is a big one. We're also very interested in discipleship, not conversions, disciples. That's a big deal to me. I also tend to be very, very marriage-minded. I'm interested in helping people have good marriages and build them up. Not sure if your listeners know us or not, but I've said that I have Asperger's, where so does my wife. In fact, that's one way we get to know each other. We both have Asperger's, so that gives us a unique marriage. In fact, when I spoke at Bill Craig's class on the 21st, my topic is the disabled, my neighbor, which is pretty much my testimony of what it's like being on the spectrum, followed by how the church can respond to people with mental illness better. And then that's part I mentioned is another aspect of what we do, reaching out to the disabled, showing the church that the disabled community needs to be acknowledged and treated well. And naturally, as you can imagine, that's an emphasis on the autism, Asperger's community, because that's where we are and we know them best. But I'd say this includes everyone. Now, if people want to donate, what they need to do is there's a link on the site that helps support the work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries. When they go there and click that link, it takes them to the ministry of the risen Jesus, my in-laws. You make your donation, then you get in touch with Mike and Debbie or me or Allie and say, hey, I made a donation. I want to go to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. We will get that donation. It will be tax deductible. And if someone can be a monthly donor, that's excellent. That's what we depend on. I also have some books on Amazon, some I've co-written, like Defining Inerrancy or God and Natural Disasters, Debate with an Atheist, or Groundless, looking at Dan Barker. And one I've written exclusively, that's the Creed for the Ages, the Apostles' Creed, Today's Christian, which covers everything, which at this point I think I need to state I do affirm the virgin birth. I think you know what that's about.
Well, I admit that's one question I wanted to ask you about, because I've seen that on several posts on the Christian Apologetics Alliance and many others. Where did that originate? Oh, by the way, I affirm the virgin birth as well. So, where did that originate?
Yeah, this is a fun thing that we do because my friend Michael Sheneko and I were on the Unbelievable Facebook page once. And this is a problem many Memphisists have and such. They don't know how to read the New Testament, how history works. They think that Paul should explicitly mention all the historical details when Paul was really functioning what's called a high context society, where background knowledge is readily assumed, and you don't explain that, you just fill in all the missing gaps and such. And someone said, well, geez, you think if Paul believed in the virgin birth, which I do affirm, he would have mentioned it. And he said, no, this would be in the background knowledge. And we said, heck, even today, that kind of rule still holds. Our pastors believe in the virgin birth, which I do affirm. And they have many Sundays that they go on and give a sermon, and they never once mentioned the virgin birth. And so it started that every single post we made, we started saying, well, by the way, I affirm the virgin birth. And it kept going on there. And today, it's a big joke thing, too, which I consider a kind of a slap in the face of the Memphis movement. Yeah, this is where your ridiculous historical standards take us.
The mystery has been solved. Now we know the origins of the statement, I affirm the virgin birth. I've been wondering that for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man, that's wonderful.
There's a blog post on my site called I Affirm the Virgin Birth. It tells the whole story.
Well, Nick, what word of encouragement would you like?
Anyway, those are all the ways that people can donate to the ministry, and I would really appreciate if they do. So.
Absolutely. And we want to, again, encourage our listeners to go to check out the resources at deeperwaters.ddns.net. And, Nick, I don't know if you remember this or not, but you encouraged me with this podcast, because I noticed that, man, you did have an all-star selection of guests on your program. And I asked you, I said, how did you get in contact? And you said the words, you said, well, ask them, the worst they can say is no. And so I've kept that in mind and used that for the podcast, especially here in recent months. So I thought that was great advice. What word of encouragement would you like to leave with the listeners?
Well, honestly, that kind of statement still applies. The worst thing people can say is no, but you'll find usually authors love to promote their books when they come out. What word of encouragement would I give? I think it's just the word of advice. Study. Please be studying. Please be learning. Please be reading. If you want to be an informed debater, read both sides on the issue as much as you can. Try to find the best scholarly books that you can. I'd also say this as a caution. When you're done studying, take some time and relax and enjoy yourself. There are so many in the apologetics community that sadly get married to their ministry as well. but we're not machines. We have to do more. Take some time, enjoy your life in other ways. Realize you are not the savior of the world. Jesus is. You don't have to answer every argument out there. Take heart, because this kind of stuff is pretty easy to deal with. One technique I'd also use in dealing with this, and I want people to understand when I say it, because it could be taken the wrong way. I am not a young earth creationist, but I am married to one. I don't object to young earth creationists. I disagree with you, but as long as you're not dogmatic and you're not saying, well, you're hell-bound or you're a compromise or something like that, I don't really have a problem with you. But what I would say is, if you're talking with a mythicist, they're quite likely an atheist. And their view is a position like, say, young earth creationism is nonsense. Okay, so what I do is I run with that. Mike and my brother-in-law and I, Mike Lacona, we recently went to a Braves game together. And on the way there, he talked about a Richard Carrier tweeting him on Twitter about how he found 7 people who were coming out and saying they were mythicists and saying, this is how a movement gets started and such. After a while, I jumped in there, and I started thinking, there are more people in the field who will argue against evolution, and there would be people who would argue against Jesus' existence. And this started back and forth, and he kept saying, well, the thing is, if we had X, Y, Z here, and I said, you know what? A younger creationist, from their perspective, would say the exact same thing about, say, evolution, for instance. Where if the evidence for Jesus was anywhere comparable to evolution, you might have a point. I said, a younger creationist would say the exact same thing in reverse. And before too long, he stopped responding. And I think that's the point. I think with mythicism, you really have to make it look ridiculous, which isn't too difficult a challenge because, frankly, it already is. You just have to show it, I should say. You need to go out there and show this is conspiracy theory thinking. But for the final encouragement, man, to say, go out there and just study. And I think the more you do it, you'll realize not only did Jesus exist, but he's the risen Lord, and he overcame death and everything else. And that really makes a difference when you apply it to your life. Now, of course, I do it imperfectly, just like everyone else, but I'm a work in progress. And if anyone wants to talk about these kinds of issues, I'd be glad to talk with them about it. This is such an important topic about such an issue that it's a shame I even have to come on and talk about this topic, but unfortunately I do. And I also consider it good news, though, because I tell people Richard Carrier is one of the greatest gifts God's given the church lately, because right now a lot of atheists on the internet and such are flocking to his every word. That might seem bad for now, but 20 or 30 years, when these are the people that are leading society from their own positions, we Christians who have been studying in the meanwhile and learning, we will be able to, as it were, corner the market when the time comes. Because our arguments will stand the test of time, the mythicist arguments will still be a joke.
Amen. Amen. Well, Nick, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for coming on. I've really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And by the way, I too also affirm the virgin birth as well. So thank you so much for being with us. I want to remind our listeners, go by and check out deeperwaters.ddns.net. Be sure to check out the blogs there, also the podcast, which is also available there as well. So once again, that's deeperwaters.ddns. Well, for Nick Peters, this has been Brian Chilton saying God bless, and remember, the truth of the risen Christ will set you free. We'll see you back here next week on the Bellator Christi.